It's a beautiful morning in the fall to build compost. In this video, we're going to talk about how to build the best compost so that your farm or acreage can thrive. So I've just built this compost pile, this windrow. I've got at least probably 20 yards, maybe a bit more of compost here. And we're gonna be using this next year. So I wanna give it at least 6 to 7 months before we go and put it to use. So I've made this with about 30% manure and the remainder, about 70%, good composted wood mulch. And in order to get the recipe, which is really important when you're building a compost pile, it's really great to get all your raw materials together. And so here's the wood mulch. You can see it behind me. It's a pretty big pile of it. And then literally make a recipe like you would any other recipe. And so this pile, this windrow, is actually an aggregate of about 3 different piles that we made. So one was like 30% manure, one was 20% manure, and one was 40% manure. And we built them with the wood mulch and the manure that we got from the farm just down the road actually. And we watched how they reacted, and the 30% pile seems to be the one that worked quite well. The trick with getting good compost is you need good ingredients. And so one of the ingredients you got to be really careful about is where you source your manure. These days, manures can have things like persistent herbicides, which can take upwards of 20 years to decompose. So you want to make sure that you're not using that material, because you can end up turning your compost into a persistent herbicide, which literally has to be scraped off your property. So be really careful about where you get your compost from. You also want to make sure that the wood mulch that you're using is well decomposed. You don't want to be able to smell any phenols in it. So you can imagine when you cut down a pine tree or a spruce tree, if that's the type of wood mulch that you're going to use, you want to make sure that when you smell it, you don't get any of those pine or fir smells. If you're going to use a deciduous tree, you want to wait at least 6 months, because all wood or all trees have antifungal properties within their sap and within their structure to make sure that parasitic funguses are not going to eat them, essentially. So you want to make sure that there's enough time to allow those wood chips to age before you go and compost them. Now, when you're making a compost, you want to make sure that it's not too wet. A lot of times I see compost and there's too much moisture in it, and it's very difficult to get that across in a video, but the rule of thumb is that when you squeeze it, you should just barely be able to get 1 drop of water out of it, and even that can be a little bit too much water. So you can imagine how much water something like this is going to absorb. We actually also have a material called Compost, which I'm going to be putting on a little bit later, and it's kind of like a Gore-Tex for compost. Now, I buy this from a guy in the United States called CV Compost. He's a really nice guy. You can look him up. I'll put his link in the show notes below. That's Champagne Valley, or Champlain Valley maybe, Compost. I think he's in Vermont. And the neat thing with Compost is that one side of it will actually shed water. So if you're in a wet ecosystem, that water will actually not absorb into the compost pile. And so it'll keep the pile from getting too wet. And then if you're in a dry environment, you flip it over to the other side, and then when it rains, it'll actually absorb that water. And then the material itself actually has a coating on it, so it won't allow any of the nitrogen or phosphorus to volatilize off of the pile. It'll actually condense it on the fabric and then put it back into the pile itself. And so it really improves the quality of the compost, making sure that it stays at the right moisture and making sure all the nutrients stay within it. The trick with good compost is making sure that you're staying within a range between about 50 and 60 degrees Celsius. I can't think of what that is in Fahrenheit right now, but when you go over it, you tend to go anaerobic, and there's actually some signs of anaerobic conditions in here right now, it's easily confused by fungi. I'm not sure if you can see that, but that's actually called, what's the name? There's a anaerobic name for it, and a lot of people think that that's fungi, but it's actually, I think it's called a cinnamocyte bacteria. I could be wrong on that. And that was actually in the manure itself, so that's a sign that there's some anaerobic activity going on in the manure, which is not great. But you can get rid of that through proper turning of the pile and making sure there's enough oxygen in there and stuff. So if you're getting over that 60 degrees Celsius, though, it means you've probably got a bit too much manure in the pile, which is a common mistake. And if you're not getting hot enough, it either means you don't have enough moisture or you don't have enough manure. So there's a bit of a diagnostic process that you have to go through in order to build good compost. Once the pile has gone through a number of cycles, which basically means every time it kind of hits 60, you want to turn the pile to kind of reset it and have it start back over again, re-energize it with oxygen. Once the pile kind of settles down and stops heating up after all of those turns, a pile that has as much carbon in it as this one does will slowly start to build a fungal component, and you basically need to stop disturbing it in order for that to happen. And so fungal hyphae will start to dominate the pile, and that will create what's called a fungally dominant compost pile, which is actually what we want for most of our systems that we're going to remediate with compost. And the reason being for that is that most of our soils are bacterial dominant because of the disturbance regime that we've put them through. And so they tend to be deficient in fungi. And so our compost piles can play a really important role helping to bring that fungi component back into our soils, which actually makes for really incredible soils. So that's the philosophy behind this pile. We're gonna let this sit over the winter. Hopefully we get a good heat before it gets really cold here, and it'll cook through the winter and then be ready for me in spring when we go and plant our shelter belt and our food forest in our gardens. So I'm not sure if you can see this, but this side here has got a bit of a sheen on it. See if I can adjust the camera. See, the weave is a little bit closer together and it's got a bit of a coating on it. Whereas this side here, it doesn't have, it has a different weave, almost like a Velcro, the opposite side of a Velcro weave. It's quite a bit softer. And so this is the absorbent side right here, and this is the side that we're gonna put on the outside so that if it does rain or any moisture hits this pile, it's gonna go through the fabric. And so that's what makes this fabric really unique. The other really interesting thing that I didn't talk about is that it's quite different than a tarp, and so it actually allows for oxygen diffusion, which is really important for creating aerobic compost. So I'm gonna go put it on the pile right now, and I'll just show you what the pile looks like. It's currently in a windrow. I've flipped it about 6 or 7 times. It's been very well hydrated. So the pile is just about perfectly moist, not too wet. Perfect for microbes to have a really happy home. Found a couple of salamanders in here, which is really interesting. So anyhow, we're gonna go put that roll of Compost Tex on. Here it is over here. It's perfect for this windrow. If you're interested in getting your own Compost Tex, you can get it from CV Compost. I'll put Steve's contact and website in the show notes below. And then once we've got the Compost Tex on, we're going to hold it down with these stones right here. So these guys will make sure it doesn't blow away. All right, so now you can see that the Compost Tex is on the pile. It's ready to be put asleep for the next 6 months. We'll check it periodically for temperature and see how it's doing. And hopefully we've got a wonderful compost for next spring when we go to plant all these amazing trees. All right, folks, hopefully you found that interesting. If you're interested in learning more about CV Compost, Champagne Valley Compost Company, check in the show notes below. Steve's a great guy to get your Compost Tex from, and it's not an affiliate link, so I don't get paid for recommending him. He's just that great of a guy. If you're gonna make your own compost, I'd recommend checking out this Compost Tex. And actually, just before I close out, I want to just mention one more thing that I use for my compost now that I'm thinking about it as a last minute thought. The these are the thermometers that I use. So this is made by Rio Temp. I'll put their link in the show notes below too. And you can see it's quite a big thermometer. It's got an ultra fast tip, so it responds pretty quickly. And it's nice and long so that you can get it into the pile and measure the core temperature. So highly recommend those thermometers. Anyhow, hopefully you found that interesting. We'll talk to you guys in the next video. Thanks so much.